we have been bringing him to New York when his little girl was a little girl. And you know, I was reading the program today and getting an update and said 24 years of age.
Well, today's her birthday. She's 26.
Oh, today is the birthday. All right, let's go around the block. All right, today is the birthday. All right, that is so wonderful. And no better date because we have chosen to bring Brother Browder to us than on the birthday, on the Earth Day of his beloved daughter. Let's give a warm round of applause, put our hands together, stand on our feet for the man of the hour from Ancestral.
Good evening, brothers and sisters. How are you? Brother Maddox was right. You know I must love you if I'm spending my daughter's birthday with you instead of my daughter. My daughter understands that liberating our people is a full-time job, and that it requires that we travel far away from home sometimes. But the important thing is we do our job and we come back home so that we can leave again. But we come back home again. And it's great to have a home to come back to. Dr. Jeffries in the house. How you doing? Yes, indeed. Well, I'm so pleased to be here. Always pleased to be with my brothers and sisters here at UAM. You all have been extremely supportive. I see a brother back in the back wearing one of our Egypt on the Potomac t-shirts. Those of you who take the field trip, next Sunday we'll have the opportunity to really see what that trip is all about. It is not a tour, it is a field trip. It's a field trip in the literal sense of the word. A field trip like the field trips you took when you were in school. It is an extension of the classroom where you're going to be exposed to historical, cultural, scientific, architectural, and symbolic information that will help you begin to understand what I refer to as secrets which have been literally hidden in plain sight. And the whole concept behind hiding secrets in plain sight is that if you want to keep something hidden from the people, you don't have to put it in a safe. You don't have to put it under 24-hour guard. The best way to hide a secret is to hide it in the open where everyone can see it. All you need to do is to separate people from their ability to understand what they see. So they'll walk past it, they'll drive past it, and they'll never know that the key to their mental salvation is right at their feet. So, you know, the field trip that I've done in Washington is something that I've been doing all over the country, because I found our fingerprints, our historical, cultural, architectural, and symbolic fingerprints everywhere I've gone in the world. It just so happens that they're probably a bit more plentiful in Washington than there are any place else, because it shows the extent to which white men value African knowledge, such that they use that knowledge in order to create what has become the capital of the wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history. They knew the value of African knowledge, and part of their job was to keep us on mental lockdown so that we could never truly understand who we were, what we came from, and what our contributions were to culture and civilization. So as long as we remain Negroes, as long as we remain mentally dispirited, then we will never be able to access that which is right within our grasp. And so these meetings that you all have here and have had through UAM for so many, many years are vital, because it is your opportunity to begin to re-immerse yourself in your history, your culture, into those traditions that will help you begin to recover your mind. Because Brother Maddox was right in terms of doing those radio interviews. You really begin to realize how sick we are. We are a sick people. But I understand the depth of that sickness. I understand the source of that sickness. And before we can truly heal ourselves, we must first acknowledge that we are sick.
That's the problem.
That's the hardest part of the problem. To acknowledge that you are sick and that you need help. And once you begin to cross that very small threshold. It may look like a major threshold, but once you cross that small threshold, then you can begin to open the door to transformations, physical transformations, mental transformations, and spiritual transformations that you have always had the power and the ability to access. And so these meetings here are significant because they help you unlock those mysteries and begin to know that which you weren't supposed to know. So I'm pleased here tonight to add to your mental development and your spiritual liberation. And the topic that I chose for my presentation this evening is entitled Barack or Not Barack, an analysis of the historical and spiritual significance of a Barack Obama presidency to America, to Black America, and to the world. And so this analysis is going to be based on investigating 6 different areas. The first area is, who is Barack to America? Who is he to Black America? And who is he to the world? The second point of interest is, does Barack really care about Black people? So this is going to be a critique of the Black critics of Barack. The third point is the significance of Obama as America's first Black president. The fourth point is racism in America dead or in a state of suspended animation? And how wrong was Jeremiah Wright? The fifth point is Barack Speaks. I want to analyze 3 of his speeches and look at the content of his words. And then the final point is, it's not about me, it's about you. Direct quote from Obama for his acceptance speech. It's not about me, it's about you. The role that African Americans must play in the upcoming presidential election. So those are the 6 areas that I'm going to examine. So the first one, who is Barack to America, Black America, and the world? The important thing is, if you look at what this man has done, he is raised in the 18 to 20 months of his presidential candidacy, he has raised approximately $500 million. More money than any presidential candidate in history. Most of this money has been raised via the internet, via $25, $50, $100 contributions that come in from all over this country. And what's important for us to realize is that most of this money has come from white people. Particularly white women. Particularly white women. So we have to begin to look at what is the appeal of Barack Obama to white America, and specifically white women. Well, the main appeal is that he's a mulatto. That his mother is European American and his father was African. Not African American or Black, he's African. He doesn't have the stain of slavery. He doesn't have the stain of the civil rights movement. He is apart from this country. So he is separated from the guilt that white folk have about what they did to our ancestors. So they can see him through a different light. And so because of the fact that so many whites have taken to Barack, many blacks have questioned his blackness. You know, who is he? Why do white folk like him so much? And in response to all of the criticism, or much of the criticism about him, in Washington, D.C., where I now live, there's a brother who I'm sure some of you all are familiar with, a brother by the name of Haile Garima. Wrote, produced, and directed a film called Sankofa. And he has a bookstore and video store on Georgia Avenue, 2 blocks north of Howard University. And one of his close colleagues, a good brother from the Caribbean, a good brother from Trinidad by the name of Ackland Lynch, who's a professor, a brilliant mind, retired professor from Howard University. And they talk a lot. And so Ackland is very politically astute, was talking about this Barack phenomenon. And so he encouraged Haile Garima to sponsor a 3-week lecture series at his space so that they could bring in scholars, activists, community organizers, and have them discuss before the community who Barack is to me. So Brother Lynch structured this program, which was held over the course of 3 weeks. The first week, you had community organizers. The second week, you had a number of scholars from Howard and several other educational institutions. The third week, you had artists, spoken word artists, and other social activists. And those 3 weeks of activities were profoundly engaging in so many different levels. So you had folk who talked about the validity of Barack running for president. You had others who said that, well, he's nothing more but an extension of this country. He won't be able to do anything for black folk. You know, so all kinds of issues came out during this discussion. And what we found is, or what I found as I was sitting in the audience observing everything, was that there were a number of people in the audience, majority of people in the audience, who weren't in favor of Barack, who were not supportive of Barack. So let me kind of put this in context for a minute. I've had the pleasure of traveling throughout this country and throughout the world, specifically within the last 6 months, 12 months. You know, my travels have taken me to India, to England twice, to Mexico, to Belize, to Egypt, and everywhere I've traveled outside of this country, everyone that I have encountered, once they found out that I was from America, they all expressed to me with great excitement about Barack running for president. Outside of this country, everybody is rooting for this man. Why? Because they hate America. They don't hate Americans. As one Egyptian told me, I don't hate Americans, I hate your government. I hate your government because your government has exported terrorism and war all over this world. Your government is disenfranchising governments and people all over this world. And in their mind's eye, to have a person of color at the helm of this government might make a difference. It might make a difference, okay? And that's one of the reasons why when Barack was in Berlin in July, over 200,000 people came out to support this African man. 200,000 people. Now you know, Berlin is a nation that doesn't have a whole lot of love for black folk. But those folk in Germany are hurting financially because of what is happening in this country. And how this country's manipulation of wealth is affecting people's pocketbooks all over the world. And so the people who don't live here know that America will be better off, that the world will be better off with someone else at the helm. And that someone that they're looking for is Barack. That's someone that they're hoping for is Barack. George W. Bush has run this country in the ground. Both of them. But this son, the latest one, is done far worse than any other president in history. He will go down in history as the worst president of the United States in the history of this nation. He is the worst. He has manipulated the government. He has manipulated your pocketbook, my pocketbook. He has created wars based on lies and cost the lives of thousands of American citizens, but hundreds of thousands of foreigners all throughout the world. He is the worst. And when he was re-elected president the second time, or re-selected president, I stand corrected. When the election was stolen the second time, I remember the front page of a newspaper in London, England, asked the question, the headline read, "How stupid are Americans to have allowed him to steal the election twice?" And we did nothing. We didn't protest. We didn't demonstrate. We just said, oh well, that's the elected process, and we went on with our business. And he went on with his business, which was the continued destruction of this nation and by extension, the rest of the world. And so others that I've encountered throughout this country know what we need to begin to understand on a very basic and fundamental level, that Barack is America's last chance to redeem itself. If they don't get it right this time, we can kiss it all goodbye. So let's look at point number 2. Does Barack really care about black people? And I want to look at some of the critiques, some of the critics of Barack. At the 3-week lecture series that Acton Lynch held at Sankofa, when he saw that there was so much overwhelming, not hatred, but distrust for Barack, Brother Ackman stood up and just asked one simple question of the audience. How many of you all have read his book? And of the 50 or 60 people in the audience, maybe 2 read his book. So he asked the question, how can you critique him? If you haven't read his book, you can't critique him based on what you've seen on television or what you read in the newspaper. Have you read his own words? Do you know how he thinks? And if you haven't done that, then you need to shut up. Plain and simple. So, Ackman's declaration made me read his book because I hadn't read it. And because he's a man who I respect, who I love, who I appreciate, I decided to read the book. And as I've read the book, I've come to understand his first book, Dreams from My Father. When I read this book, I came to understand that Barack Obama is blacker than most black folk that I know, including a whole lot of folk who consider themselves to be African-centered. I'm telling you the honest God truth, based on my reading of his book. His book is a soulful telling of a black man in search for his father, in search for his identity. And as he talked about this search, I can relate to it because I spent my life as a black man searching for my father. I don't know who my father was, never met him. I spent my life searching for my identity as a black man in the world. And so I can identify with his quest, the basic quest that every person has. Who am I? Where did I come from? And what is it in me that drives me to do the things you do? If you're lucky and have 2 parents, then part of that question can be answered. Because you can look at your parents and see yourself in them, their speech, their walk, their talk. But if you're separated from one of your parents, then 50% of you will never know. And you don't know how deeply that bothers someone until you're missing that 50%. So his book deals with that. He talks about the fact that he was raised by a white mother from Kansas who introduced him to black literature. Talked about the fact when he was a child, his mother was the one who introduced him to the works of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, James Baldwin. Because she knew that as a black man living in America, or a white man's world, he would need to know who he was. She didn't raise him to be a colored guy, or a black-white person. She knew that he was going to be a black man. And so she prepared him to deal with life as best she could as a black man. So remember in his presidential acceptance speech, he talked about the fact that his mother woke him up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do his homework because she wanted to prepare him for a world that was going to be anti-black male. How many mothers do you all know check their children's homework, let alone wake them up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do it? So let's get serious. Let's be honest with ourselves as we assess this man. He talked about the fact that after his mother remarried and he was in high school, he decided to come back to Hawaii to stay with his grandparents so that he could go to school in Hawaii. And as he talked about this relationship with his grandfather, who was more like a father to him, and if you read the story about his grandfather and his grandfather's relationship with his grandfather's life was kind of similar to the life of most black men I knew. He was struggling to make ends meet. He was struggling living in a household where the female in the household was making more money than he was. He was frustrated with life. had hopes, had high hopes, but was never able to achieve his high hopes. He talked about when they were living in Hawaii, he would always go down with his grandfather every night to a local bar. His grandfather would have a drink, and it just so happens, based on his description, the bar was in the black part of Hawaii. It was a black bar. Everybody in the bar was black. They knew him on a first name basis, and he hung out with black folk. So while Granddad was sitting down, drinking his beer, talking with the brothers, Barack was sitting down at the bar, drinking his Coke, talking with other folk in the bar. So he grew up around us. He knows our issues, and he's very clear about who he is. And then after college, after he graduated from Columbia, he moved to Chicago, my hometown. Moved to Chicago. And specifically, he got a job as a community organizer working in Argyle Gardens. Now, I grew up on the west side of Chicago. Argyle Gardens is on the far south side of Chicago. I didn't go to Argyle Gardens, all right? I didn't go to Argyle Gardens because as a black man living in Chicago, you knew that there were certain places you don't go because white folk would beat you up and your own folk would beat you up if you're from the wrong neighborhood. So he worked in Argyle Gardens. So I can respect him going back into the community to work with our folk. He could have got a decent job working on Wall Street here in New York, or working in downtown Chicago or DC or Philadelphia, but he chose to work with his own people. So we have to acknowledge that. And in the book he talks about his relationships with people in Chicago. He talks about the various communities that he lived in and worked in Chicago. So I can relate to this book again on many different levels because he was talking about my city. He was talking about people that I knew, that I grew up with. And there's a passage in the book where he talks about meeting this brother, this older brother, who was training young men or preparing young men for high school. And I want to read you this passage, a couple of passages from this section of the book because it describes his understanding of what black children, specifically male children, have to go through in this country. He met this brother, he was introduced to this brother named Asante, who was a counselor for young men. He said that we followed Dr. King's directions to a small office toward the rear of the building. It was decorated with African themes, a map of the continent, posters of ancient African kings and queens, a collection of drums and gourds, and a kente cloth wall hanging. Behind the desk sat a tall, imposing man with a handlebar mustache and a prominent jaw. He was dressed in an African print, an elephant hair bracelet around the thick wrist. And he seemed a bit put off at first. And he had a stack of SAT papers. So let me go on. He said the first thing, and so he was talking to Barack and his assistant about the work that they were doing as community organizers and the people that they were interacting with. So I want you to listen to this statement from Brother Asante here. The first thing you have to realize, he said, looking at Johnny and me in turn, is that the public school system is not about educating black children. Never has been. Inner city schools are about social control, period. They operate as holding pens, miniature jails, really. It's only when black children start breaking out of their pens and bothering white people that society even pays attention to the issue of whether or not these children are being educated. Just think about what a real education for these children would involve. It would start by giving a child an understanding of himself, his world, his culture, his community. That's the starting point of any educational process. That is what makes a child hungry to learn. The promise of being part of something, of mastering his environment. For the black child, everything is turned upside down. From day one, what is he learning about? Someone else's history, someone else's culture. Not only that, this culture he's supposed to learn is the same culture that has systematically rejected him and denied his humanity. All right, now that's a foundation, that's a discourse on education, a basic understanding of education. And then he talks about the fact that he chooses to expose these children to African history, African geography, artistic traditions. I try to give them a different values orientation, something to counteract materialism and individualism and instant gratification that's fed to them the other 15 hours of the day. I teach them that African people are a communal people, that Africans respect their elders. So he lays out a basic foundation, and he incorporated this conversation in his book, which means that this conversation had meaning and value to him. What's important in this description of coming into Asante's office, he describes the poster on the wall with the African kings and queens. You all have seen those posters, haven't you? The Budweisers, great kings and queens of Africa, all right? And what's so interesting about it is that I remember in the conversation I had with Dr. Clark, Dr. Johnny Clark, years ago. Dr. Clark had shared with me that he wrote the narratives for those posters. And as he was discussing that with some of his colleagues ragged on him for being associated with Budweiser. Now, you know Budweiser, I mean, they're producing this alcohol that's killing our people. And Dr. Clark said, well, listen, fool, our people gonna drink the Budweiser anyway. So we might as well give them something to learn while they're drinking the Bud. That's real. That is real. And I can't tell you how many thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives were touched by those posters. You don't understand the extent to which something small, something seemingly insignificant and anti-African can plant seeds in the minds of someone, whether they are conscious of it or not. And so we've got to begin to look at our situation from multiple perspectives before we start criticizing our people for what they do. A couple of other passages in the book, Wright describes his journey to Africa to visit his father's relatives after his father died. Now the book begins with him receiving a phone call from his sister in Africa that his father died in a car accident. And Barack only knew his father for 1 month. His father met his wife when they were students at the University of Hawaii. Got pregnant, he lived with them for about 2 years, and then he left, returned to Africa. He didn't come back until Barack was about 10 for Christmas, stayed for a month, and then he was gone again and never saw his father again. So he spends this book, dreaming about his father. Because everyone said how bright his father was. Everyone talked about how much character and how he could walk into a room and just change the energy in the room with his presence. And so he tried to imagine the presence, the power of this man. He tried to imagine that power manifesting itself in him as he tried to find his place in the world. And then there's a description here where he finally goes to Kenya to visit his father's relatives and to go to his father's grave. And there's an interesting conversation that takes place when he's in the airport in Nairobi. His baggage is lost. And so he meets with the teller to fill out the form to secure his luggage. And let me just read you this short passage, which again gives you some insight into the mind of this man. He said, I completed the form and gave Miss Omoro, I gave it back to Miss Omoro, who gave it the once over before looking back at me. She said, you wouldn't be related to Dr. Obama by chance? He said, well, yes, he was my father. Miss Omoro smiled sympathetically. I'm very sorry about his passing. Your father was a close friend of my family's, and he would come often to our house when I was a child. He said the very fact that she recognized my name, that had never happened before, I realized. Not in Hawaii, not in Indonesia, not in LA or New York or Chicago. For the first time in my life, I felt the comfort, the firmness of identity that a name might provide, and how it might carry an entire history in other people's memories, so that they might nod and say knowingly, oh, you're so-and-so's son. No one here in Kenya would ask how to spell my name or mangle it with an unfamiliar tongue. My name belonged and so I belong, drawn into a web of relationships, alliances, and grudges that I did not yet understand. So it's about finding self and appreciating those little things that we take for granted, those little things that we aren't even conscious of, that help to ground you in a greater sense of self than we can ever imagine. Even the title of the book is significant. The book is entitled Dreams from My Father, a story of race and inheritance. Dreams from my father, not dreams of my father, but dreams from my father. And as a graphic artist, as I look at the cover of the book, I noticed that in the design of the book, all of the words are initial caps, except from, which is in all lowercase. So this was designed in order to draw your attention to the word from, so that you can understand on a very basic and fundamental level, he is not dreaming of his father, he is tapping into the ancestral memory of his father. All right? Understand what is here. It's hard to see it if your mind is filled with hatred, or if your mind is filled with confusion. It's hard to see reality if you're blinded by other issues. And so it's important to realize that we have to look at this man on several different levels. There's another passage in the book that I'd like to share with you that again deals with this issue of identity and also reinforces this quest for a black man to find his father, to identify with positive aspects of his father. This next passage I want to read to you is a conversation between Barack and one of his co-workers, a brother named Johnny. And in this particular passage, Johnny is talking about his father. So here's a black man talking about his father. And I want you to listen to this discussion, because it's an apt description of how most black men feel about their fathers. He says here, Johnny says, it's funny, he said, how listening to Asante back there made me think about my old man. And then he goes on to talk about his father. He said, never seemed like he really enjoyed life. You know what I mean? On weekends, he just hang around the house with some of my uncles, and they would come over and drink and listen to music. They complained about what their bosses had done to them this week. The man did this. The man did that. But if one of them actually started talking about something different or had a new idea, the rest of them would tear the guy up. How some no-count nigga like you gonna start some business, one of them would say. And then somebody else would say, take that glass away from Jimmy. That wine done gone to his head. And they all be laughing. But I could tell that they weren't really laughing inside. Sometimes if I were around, my uncles started talking about me. Hey boy, that's some knobby head you got there. Hey boy, you starting to sound just like the white man with all those big words. Johnny blew a steam of smoke into the hazy air. When I was in high school, I felt ashamed of him, my old man, I mean, working like a dog, sitting there getting drunk with his brothers. I swore that I would never end up like that. But you know, when I thought about it later, I realized that my old man never laughed when I talked about wanting to go to college. I mean, he never said anything one way or the other, but he always made sure that me and my brother got up for school, and that we didn't have to work, and that we had a little walking around money. The day that I graduated, I remember he showed up in a jacket and a tie and just shook my hand. That's all. He just shook my hand, and then he went back to work. So Barack says to him, but he was there, Johnny. Who? Your father. He was there for you. Yeah, Barack, I guess he was. Did you ever tell him that? No, we're not really good at talking. Johnny looked at the window, and then he turned to me. Maybe I should, huh? Yeah, John, I said, nodding. Maybe you should. All right? Black men, searching to find identity, searching to find relationships with other black men. Particularly the most important black man in your life, your father. But too many black men don't have fathers, don't know their fathers. So I want you all to understand very clearly that without that 50% of yourself, you are not whole. I don't care who you are, I don't care how much education you have, you are not whole. So in this book, he talks about trying to complete himself, trying to get whole. And he did that by trying to find his roots, something that many of us can't do by virtue of the fact that many of us don't know where in Africa our foreparents came from. But he was fortunate in that he was able to go to the village, see his grandparents, go to his grandfather's tomb, and participate in the rituals that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. The third point I want to look at is the significance of Obama as America's first obviously black president. And in doing so, I want to do a quick overview of J.E. Rogers' little pamphlet, which was published in 1965, Five Negro Presidents. I'm surprised, I'm shocked at the number of our folk that have never heard of this book, let alone read it. And it's 18 pages. It's 18 pages.
Read that on your coffee break.
The title of the book, the working title of the book is Five Negro Presidents According to What White People Say They Were by J.E. Rogers, and it was published in 1965. The five Negro presidents were Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, who served 2 terms from 1801 to 1809. The second black president was Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, who also served 2 terms from 1825 to 1837. The third Negro president was Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, who served from 1861 until 1865 when he was assassinated, going into his 2nd term. The fourth Negro president was Warren G. Harding, the 29th president of the United States, who served from 1929 to 1923 when he died of food poisoning. And on the cover of this book is Warren G. Harding and a photograph of his grandfather, his black grandfather. Okay? And the 5th Negro president was not listed in the book. He made reference to him, but he wasn't listed because he was still alive. But that president was Wright D. Eisenhower. And I don't know how many of you all are familiar with Dr. Edward Nichols, who's a psychologist from Washington, D.C. But when I first met Dr. Nichols, he talked about the fact that after Kennedy was elected president, Life magazine did an expose, cover story, on all of the living presidents of the United States. And they had on the cover a photograph of Dwight D. Eisenhower as a child and his mother. And his mother was black. His mother was a mulatto, all right? And so that was on the cover of Look magazine. It was on newsstands all throughout the country. Somebody saw that cover, made a telephone call, and in 24 hours, every single magazine was taken off the newsstand and was placed with a different cover. All right? Now, all 5 of these men were black, according to the 1 drop rule. You know, they were either quadroons or octoroons. This term was popularized by Thomas Jefferson in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. And according to him, 1 drop of black blood made a white man black. Now that's black power if I ever heard it. 1 drop makes you me. All right? And so because of the fact that these men were living in a racist country and they were light enough to pass, they passed. They passed. And they became president of the United States. There's a whole lot of black folk who are passing.
That's right. Oh
yeah.
Did you all know that J. Edgar Hoover is passing? The Hoover family are Negroes who have passed for white. And it's something about the hatred of self that we have that causes us to aggress against our own even when we're passing. So it helps you understand Hoover's hatred for Dr. King because of who Hoover was, not who King was. All right? So we've got to look at these issues. So if Barack Obama is elected president, we will have to understand that he is a mulatto. All right? And thus he would be the first phenotypically identifiable black president of the United States. So the question is that we have to raise, as everyone is talking about, Barack Obama could potentially be the first black president, why aren't we talking about this history? This is a great opportunity to educate our own and maybe white America in the process. This is an opportunity that we should not be passing by. Every child in every classroom should have a copy of this book so that this could be discussed. This is a hot topic. The important thing about understanding the significance of moments in time. Certain moments in time are pregnant with possibility. And so you have to be able to recognize those moments and impregnate those moments with the possibilities of changing the world. This is one of those moments. So we have to look at ourselves. What are we doing to capitalize on these moments? These are opportunities that you must first recognize as opportunities and then have the knowledge to know what to do to take advantage of this opportune moment. You can't just sit back and complain because you don't like what's going on. There's something that you can do. Anybody can complain. Matter of fact, that's the easiest thing in the world to do, to sit on your butt and talk about somebody who is doing something. Issue is, what are you doing? What are we doing to take advantage of these moments? And so, one of the reasons why we aren't talking about these issues is because we don't know our history. We don't know our history, and we don't know that we don't know our history. Talk about we're black folks, but we don't even know our history from 40 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And there's no excuse for that. There's no excuse whatsoever for us to be as ignorant as we are. As Alton was saying, the reason why we talk so crazy is because most of us are ignorant. We're not illiterate because we can read. We're illiterate because we don't read. If you have the capacity to read and to internalize what you've read, it will dramatically change the quality of your thinking and the quality of your conversation. That's something that we can do. That's something that we have control over. So, I want us to understand that we cannot expect our former enslavers to teach us our history. That's not going to happen. That's not their job. That's our responsibility. To educate ourselves, educate our children, to educate the children on our block. To spend some time talking to them, reading to them, helping them begin to understand this process called life so that they can make better choices. I'd like for you all to do something for me. I'd like for you to close your eyes for me. Close your eyes. And I want you to use your imagination. And I want you to imagine the front page of your local newspaper on Wednesday, November the 5th. And I want you to look at that headline. Obama wins the election. Now, how does that make you feel? Looking at that, how does that make you feel? Internally, deep inside. Now, there's a passage in the book when Barack first came to Chicago, he went to a barbershop to get a feel for get a pulse of the community. And this is shortly after Harold Washington had been elected mayor of Chicago. And the brothers were talking about how Harold Washington, being elected president, just so profoundly impacted every black person in America. He said it was just like when Joe Louis beat Max Melly. Everybody was excited. Everybody was rooting for him because it was the first time that we got control. Now granted, there were some folks who had some issues with Harold Washington because politics, now you know, politics is a dirty game. And if you're in the game, you gotta play dirty. I mean, there's no question about it. But Harold knew how to work that game, knew how to work it enough in order to win that election. He didn't do everything to change, but he did make some profound changes. And changes come with time. You need opportunities and time. I want you to imagine that if Obama is elected president, or I saw Dr. Fukuyama. You all familiar with Dr. Fukuyama?
Yes.
He was in Washington last month to do a lecture. And when he walked in the door, he was wearing an Obama pin. And I said to him, it's obvious who your candidate for president is. And he looked at me with all seriousness because Dr. Fukuyama was a very serious brother, a deep brother, very serious brother. And he said, the ancestors have said that Obama is going to win. So he was dealing with this situation from a totally different perspective than I was. The ancestors said that he is the right man for the job at this particular point in time in history. I want us to understand how just on a psychological level, how Barack will affect everybody in this country, not just black folks, but everybody in this country. Do you realize that his photograph will be in every federal office in this country? So even white folk who don't like black folk, and will have to see his picture on their wall for at least 4 years. Understand the psychological effect that that image of that black man is going to have on them on a conscious and subconscious level. Understand that in every military installation throughout the world, every embassy throughout the world, his picture is going to hang on that wall. We can't just deal with things on a superficial level. We got to begin to understand that things manifest themselves on a spiritual and a mental level. And all of these things are going to be working within the next couple of months. So we got to begin to broaden our perspective of this moment in time, where we are in this moment in time, and how we must use our time to take advantage of every single second. Fourth point I want to talk about is racism dead or in a state of suspended animation. Barack addressed the issues of race in his book, Dreams of My Father, a story of race and inheritance. So he was very clear about these issues of race. The book was published in 1995, 4 years after he graduated from Harvard Law School, 9 years before he spoke at the Democratic Convention in 2004, where he delivered a keynote address. So this book was written before anybody ever heard of Barack Obama. And he laid out his heart and soul. He talked about what life was like for him as a child. Talked about getting high. Talked about shooting school. He's talking about all the things that any young child does growing up. And he talked about how he found himself and charted a course for his life. Again, the issue that impressed me was that Barack chose to work as a community organizer in the south side of Chicago. Chicago was, in the early 80s, and still is today, and it certainly was the 21 years that I lived in Chicago from actually 20 years, from 1951 to 1971, Chicago was and still is the most racially segregated city in the United States of America. It still is, even more so than New York, even more so than New York. If you all recall, in the 60s, Dr. King decided to move his civil rights movement from the South, came to Chicago. He came to Chicago, not Cicero, not Cicero. Cicero has changed. Chicago has changed a lot over the years. Black folk live in Cicero now, you know. But Martin Luther King decided that he was going to integrate community in Marquette Park. Marquette Park was on the near south side, around 35th Street. Black folk, when I was growing up in Chicago, you don't drive through Marquette Park. Marquette Park was a lot like Bensonhurst. You don't drive through Marquette Park. You don't walk through Marquette Park. But Dr. King decided that he was going to integrate this all-white community. And those of you all who are old enough to remember when King was living in Chicago, you probably remember the images in the newspaper and on the television news where there were crowds of white folk, hundreds and hundreds of white folk, men, women, and children, protesting his presence in their neighborhood, spitting at him. You would think that these things were taking place down in Birmingham, Alabama, or Meridian, Mississippi. This is on the south side of Chicago. And in one event, up south, exactly right. And one particular occasion is Dr. King was walking through this crowd with Jesse and all of his other lieutenants. Someone took a brick and threw it at King, hit him in the head. And Dr. King, when he got into the department, began to reconsider his decision, trying to integrate this community in Chicago. He said, now I've dealt with racism all throughout the South, but I have never experienced racism as he was experiencing in my hometown, Chicago. Matter of fact, Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley, came into his apartment and said, look, I can't protect you in this neighborhood. You know, so if you want to make your point, I would suggest you do it someplace else. So what did King do? He left the South Side and he went into a project on the near North Side. So he changed his focus, but he still talked about the disparities of housing in Chicago. Now, Chicago housing projects, some of the worst housing projects in the world. New York is bad, but Chicago, some of the worst in the world. And I didn't really understand how bad it was. I mean, I knew folk who lived in the projects, and they would tell me stories about the murders that took place within the projects on a regular basis, the rapes that took place in the projects, all of the beatings and shootings and stabbings that took place. Our folk killing our folk every single day. And it wasn't until I was older that I began to understand what this whole process is all about. It's really a process of social engineering. When I was a freshman in Chicago, freshman in college, I was majoring in architecture. And I attended the University of Illinois. And I remember that in the School of Architecture, the lobby of the building, there was this display that the senior class had built. It was a display of modular housing that was made out of cardboard for a rat population that was encased in plexiglass. And so I would see it every day coming in and out of this building. And then after about a month into the semester, our instructor told us that the other professors in the department needed our help because the rat population in this modular city had grown faster than the upperclassmen could make additional modular units for them. So they asked us, the lowerclassmen, to come and assist them in making these modular units, because what was happening was that once this city of rats had become overpopulated and there wasn't enough space for the rats to have their own comfort zone, they started fighting each other. They started killing each other and cannibalizing the dead. So after about a week, when we made additional units and put those units within that plexiglass enclosure, the violence went down. The murders went down within this rat population. And so it was about a decade later when I came back to Chicago to visit John Jackson, who was living in a nursing home on the near south side of Chicago. And as I was walking to his nursing home, I walked past the Illinois Institute of Technology. Now I remember, being in that building for a couple of projects when I was working in the School of Architecture, being in that building for a couple of projects. And then right a block down the street was the beginning of the projects. And these projects, Robert Taylor projects, these projects are about 13 stories high. Each building would hold maybe 1,000, 1,500 people. And mostly it's women, children, no men. Because in order to get into public housing, there couldn't be a man in the household. As a matter of fact, social workers would often knock at the door 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to do a home inspection. And if there was a man in the house, then you and your children would be kicked out of public housing. And so, when I be in these buildings, there were 4 buildings to a block, and they stretched for over a mile. And they were all throughout the city. So as I walked toward the nursing home to see John Jackson, walked past the Illinois Institute of Technology, and saw down the street these projects, that's when I realized that this all is social engineering. All of this was designed in order to destroy 3 generations of African people.
Right.
Separate families, separate the men from the wives, the children from their fathers, so that this dysfunctionality could be passed down from generation to generation to generation.
Right.
And I applaud Barack for going to Chicago to work in this community to make a difference in the lives of young black men who needed some positive male images to relate to. Okay? So, in the book, he talked about his community. Barack lived in the hood, lived with black folk, lived in the neighborhood that some of us wouldn't want to live in. So he's well aware that racism is a game created by whites.
Yeah.
Whites wrote the rules of the game. They manufactured the deck. They dealt the hand. And then they want to accuse him of playing the race card.
How about that?
Understand how this game is played. Hillary Clinton can talk about putting 18 million cracks in the glass ceiling and appeal to female voters. John McCain can talk about spending 5.5 years as a prisoner of war and appeal to veterans. Sarah Palin can talk about being a soccer mom or a pit bull with lipstick and appeal to mothers. But when Bill Clinton suggested that the only reason that black voters were voting for Barack was because he was black, and Barack expressed his displeasure with that comment, then they accused him of playing the race card. What is that? What kind of craziness is that? Everybody else can talk about issues that define them as people except us. And in the middle of that, he still is dealing with the issue, simply because he's black. But the reality is, he can't deal with race directly. It has to be indirectly. As a presidential candidate, he can only talk about race in the context of supposedly racist remarks that were made by his former minister, Jeremiah Wright. Right? So let's look at this Wright situation for a minute, and let's analyze his comments and the context in which his comments were made. Since Reverend Wright burst on the scene with his soundbite of "Goddamn America," which was played over 500 times in 1 week, over and over and over and over again. That's the media doing that in order to connect Barack to this minister. So that even though he wasn't talking about race, he went to the church of Reverend Wright, so obviously these must be his thoughts as well. Projection and association. The interesting thing is about Wright's comments, I have not spoken to one Negro, I have not spoken to one black person, I have not spoken to one colored or African American who disagreed with what Wright said. All of us know that Wright was right. His comments were absolutely right. And anybody who lives in America truly understands what he was saying to be true. And Barack initially addressed those issues. That the black church is different than a white church. And that we talk about issues in our churches that white folks don't talk about in their churches. Because of how we relate to this country and how we relate to the Lord. But the interesting thing is that Wright's comments were comments that were somewhat similar to Malcolm's comments 45 years ago when he said chickens were coming home to roost. Malcolm was kicked out of the nation when he made those comments. Remember that? Yeah. He was kicked out the Nation of Islam.
Right.
For talking about the assassination of John F. Kennedy and saying America's chickens are coming home to roost. Khalid Muhammad was kicked out of the Nation of Islam when he made comments about the Pope.
Yeah. They got him on that dress.
All right. So let's put all of this in context. Anytime a black person speaks out, a high-profile black person speaks out and talks about racial issues in this country, he is kicked to the curb. All right? So, let's look at this. Wright's comments that he made at this church were right on point. But the comments that he made several weeks later in Detroit at the NAACP convention, and then the next day at the press club in Washington, D.C., was when it became clear to most folk that Wright had lost his mind. Now let me put this in context, all right? Because anytime you're speaking before an audience, you really have to be careful of what you say and how you say it. Particularly if you are a target of the media. You don't give the media the most powerful form of mind control and manipulation. You don't give them any ammunition to use against you, or by extension, anyone who has been associated with your church, Barack Obama. So when Wright spoke at the NAACP convention, and he talked about the educational differences between black children and white children, he raised issues that were right on point, but they were over the head of most of the people in his audience. So what was he doing? He was, in my humble estimation, he was showing off. He was showing off. Now there's nothing wrong with doing that, but you have to do it in the right context. If you're going to talk about information that most people are not familiar with, then you need to provide documentation. You need to provide documentation, especially if your presentation is being broadcast all over the world. That broadcast wasn't just for the United States, it was being broadcast by C-SPAN all over the world. So this was his opportunity to educate everyone throughout the world. And he didn't, in my humble estimation, he didn't do everything that he could have done and should have done at that opportune moment. It was a missed opportunity because he was showboating. Got so caught up in showboating that he struck the Q pose. What kind of nonsense is that? Has this Negro lost his mind? You don't do that. You don't do that with an international audience. You don't do that. There's certain things that you do with family behind closed doors. This is family. I will say and do certain things with family, but that I won't do with the larger audience because I know that they don't look at me like you look at me. And I've got to say things to appeal to them on a different level because they're evaluating me different than how you will evaluate me. And the idea is, anytime you speak to a large audience, you want to have the entire audience move with you. You don't want to lose them by saying something that they may misinterpret. So you are very careful or very structured about what you say and how you say it, if you care about your message and how your message is going to be received. The following day, when Wright spoke at the press club, the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., that's when he lost it. Now, he's a bright man, he's an educated man, he is an articulate man, but he should have known that he was being set up. He should have known that he was being set up. He was there in D.C. for a conference of black ministers that was being held at Howard School of Divinity. The meeting at the press club was set up by Barbara Reynolds, who is a supporter of Hillary Clinton. So they set up that meeting knowing how Wright is, knowing how large his ego is, putting him in front of his peers, knowing that he's going to cut up. And he did cut up. His talk was good, but then he went overboard during the Q&A session when he started attacking that poor white girl who was asking the question, the moderator of the program. All right? Now, he almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. But you got to understand how other people watching this How white folk, Hispanic folk, other folk watching that reacted to this black man beating this white girl down. That's what it was, a beat down. It was a verbal beat down. And he should have known you don't do that before an international audience. You don't do that because you're going to draw negative attention to yourself, to your church, to your parishioners, and to anybody associated with you. His ego was out of check. And he's paid for it because you have not heard from him since, have you? You have not heard from him since. And there's some stuff that has been surfacing that I don't know if some folk are holding this for a late October surprise. But and I don't want to get into it now because I don't want to gossip. But it was because of this speech that Obama finally had to distance himself from Jeremiah Wright. Now, as he said in his first speech in response to Wright's comments about goddamn America, he said that, this is the man who married me, who baptized my children. This is the man who's like a father to me. So I can imagine how Barack man felt trying to understand why Wright was doing what he did. Why would Wright throw him under the bus? That is what he did. He threw him under the bus. Was it ego? Was he envious of the attention that he was getting? I don't know. We'll probably find out when Michelle writes the book and tells what was really going on. But the reality of the situation is this, brothers and sisters. The racial dynamics in this country are changing. America is rapidly becoming a multicultural and pluralistic society. And black folk have to adjust to that reality. It was about 7 years ago that Hispanics became the #1 minority in the United States. Hispanics are #1, we're #2, and in about 15 years we'll fall down to #3 behind Asians. So if we have not achieved parity as a #1 minority, what do you think is going to happen when we're down the #2 slot? What do you think is going to happen when we fall to the #3 slot? And based on census reports last month, that in 2042, 8 years ahead of their projections, white folk will become a minority in the United States for the first time in U.S. history. Hispanics will become the dominant population in this country, followed by us, followed by Asians. And if you look at the statistics, you look at the growth, the demographics of the various groups within this country, you'll see that white growth has been growing maybe about 2 or 3% per decade. Hispanic population has been growing by almost 20-30% per decade. African American growth has remained stagnant for over 45 years, which means that there are as many of us being born as there are dying. Zero population growth. And most of us are dying at the hands of other black folk, and we're dying at our own hand as a result of the foods that we put into our body, this stuff that some folk call food. We're killing ourselves. So, we have to take all of this into account in order to assess where this country is going. So that racial dynamics are changing such that we won't be able to blame whitey for all of our problems now. Because they won't be in the minority, they won't be in the majority. Hispanics will begin to be in the majority. And Hispanics are, for the most part, they are living in Washington, D.C. area. Washington, D.C. has the highest percentage of Salvadorians of any country outside of El Salvador, right? And they're coming in large numbers, and it's obvious that they're coming in was planned in order to displace the African American population. That's real clear. They're doing jobs that we used to do, or jobs that we don't want to do. And as a consequence, they are building families. They are living the American dream. They still have, at this particular point in time, in their sojourn in America, they still have nuclear families. And they still do things as a family. Things that we stopped doing a long time ago. Right? So they are moving into political arenas, and they begin to become aldermen and women. They begin to become mayors and governors. they're not going to tolerate all of this nonsense that we have been tolerating in our community. So we need to get our act together, because this country is changing.
Very much so.
And if we want to be a part of change, there's work that we have to do. So let me look at an analysis of a couple of speeches by Wright. So let's look at his thoughts and his words. Again, if you really want to understand somebody, listen to what they say, not what someone says they said. Listen to what they say. Listen to how they say it. Listen to the context in which they say it, so that you can begin to get an understanding of how they think. Barack Obama is truly a talented and gifted speaker. And since we know that thought precedes speech, that means that by extension he is an even more talented and gifted thinker. When Africans were enslaved in this country, we had to learn to talk in code around the white man and around Negroes, certain Negroes. Now that we are free, and many of us still work on plantations from 9 to 5, y'all know that you still have to talk in code around white folk and around Negroes. All right? So when you listen to Barack talk, I want you to be aware that he is talking in code. He has one message for the general American population, and there's another message embedded in that speech that is directed to us. Now, he can't come out and say, I'm going to do this for black folk, I'm going to do that for black. He can't come out and say that, because he'll lose the white vote. But if you listen to what he says, how he says it, and the context in which he says it, you will hear what he's saying to us. So you have to cultivate the ability not just to listen, but to hear what is not being said, and to understand that there's another level of communication that is going on. So I want to look at a couple of his speeches. The speech on race that he gave in Philadelphia on March 18th. In response to Jeremiah Wright's comments. He put the issue of race in a historical context, and he talked about America and slavery. I have not heard very many people do this. For the national television, he talked about the history, he put it in context, and then he talked about the ability for everybody to move beyond that. Not forget it. Understand the issue and understand what is necessary to move beyond that. He described his relationship with Jeremiah Wright, with Trinity Church, and he specifically identified 11 o'clock on Sunday as the most segregated hour in America. White folk go to a white church and pray to a white guy. Black folk go to a black church and pray to a white guy. It is what it is. It is what it is. Contrary to the thoughts and wishes of others, Obama has overcome the wrongs of Jeremiah Wright. He did not separate himself from Jeremiah Wright. Wright pushed him away, kicked him underneath the bus. In his speech, Obama addressed the issues of race head on, and then he moved on. He won the primary races. He won the Democratic presidential nomination. And he can potentially win in November with your help. If you look at his Father's Day speech, which was held at a church in Chicago, June 15, 2008, in his speech, Barack used scripture in order to frame his discussion about fathers. Specifically, he used Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus preached about a man building his house on a rock which has a firm foundation. And Barack used this message to illustrate that family also has to be built on a strong foundation. Family is the foundation of every community. And the man, the father, is to be the rock of that family, the rock of that community. And then he talked about the fact that too many black men were not holding up their end, were not doing their job. And some folk got mad at him because he was telling the truth. But he was saying what needs to be said. We all know it. We all lived it. Let me share with you a couple of statistics that he provided in order to substantiate his claim that black men needed to start stepping up. He said, quoting here, "We know that more than half of all black children live in single-parent households, a number which has doubled since the time that we were children. We know the statistics. The children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime. They are 9 times more likely to drop out of school and 20 times more likely to go to prison." These are facts. This is the truth, like it or not. They are more likely to have behavior problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundation of our communities are weaker because of it. This is the truth. And we need to be courageous enough to face the truth. Our men are not being men. They're not acting like men. Part of the problem is many of them didn't have men in the household. And I have to be honest with these sisters, a woman cannot raise a man. A mother cannot raise a man. My mother could not raise me to be a man. I needed men in my life to help me understand certain things that my mother didn't understand or couldn't explain to me. So we need men, courageous men, strong men to work in our communities, to be models, to be examples for our children, for our daughters, for our nation and our community. Barack proceeded to give examples as to what men could do to improve the quality of their lives and their community lives. So he didn't just talk about the problem, he gave statistics to validate the problem, and then he gave solutions to the problem. That's what you're supposed to do if you want to help somebody. You don't just criticize them. You help them understand what the issues are, and you give them the means by which they may help themselves. So the conclusion was simple. It says it's a simple and truthful message which needs to be repeated over and over again until it sinks into our heads and we realize that the only way we can change our condition is to confront our condition. We can't run away from it. You can't deal with the truth by simply ignoring it or wishing it away, or committing character assassination upon the messenger of that truth. So in that context, I gotta say, shame on Tavis Smiley. I gotta say, shame on Cornel West for being overly critical of his speech. I have to say, shame on Michael Eric Dyson for getting on Bill Cosby for saying the same thing. Now come on, now we gotta be serious. You know, folk accuse Cosby, folk accuse Barack of airing our dirty laundry. But don't you realize the world can see your dirty drawers because our children are walking around with their pants hanging out off their behind. What people on this planet allow their children to walk out of the house like that? No one. No one on any country that I've gone to allows their children to accept such dysfunctionality as the validity of their humanity. That is insane. That is unacceptable behavior. And as long as we are silent on this issue, the world will continue to look at us as if we have lost our minds. And so we can't do better until we start acting better. And I applaud any black man who holds black men up to a higher standard. We need to have regular discussions like this on an ongoing basis. At Barack's Democratic DNC presidential acceptance speech last month, he talked about a number of important things. I call this speech the Promise of America speech. You can do what you will. And in this speech, Barack talked about what was wrong with America. He identified George Bush as the source of many of America's ills. And then he linked McCain to George Bush. He went on to talk about the economy. And he talked about the promises that he would keep as President of the United States, and then he proceeded to detail those promises. And he said that he promised to help you if you would help your community. Huh? I would help you, but you got to help yourself. I can't do it all for you. And then he broadened his Father's Day message to talk about all fathers in this country needed to step up and do more. And then he delivered his punchline with the skill of Muhammad Ali in his prime, right? When he said, I get it. I realize that I'm not the likeliest candidate for the office. I don't fit the typical pedigree, he said. But I stand here before you tonight because all across America, something is stirring. What the naysayers don't understand is that this election has never been about me. It's about you. It's about you. And understanding that this is an opportunity for every single one of us. He said that history teaches us that at defining moments like this one, the change we need doesn't come from Washington. Change comes to Washington. Change happens because the American people demand it, because they rise up, because they insist on new ideas and new leadership and a new politics at a new time. That's what we need. Because the same old is not going to cut it. Said America, this is one of these moments. I believe that as hard as it will be, the change that we need is coming because I've seen it. He's seen it. He has lived that change. And he truly has. He is an international brother. Born and raised in Hawaii, moved to Indonesia when his mother remarried, came back to Hawaii for high school, and then went to college in LA, and then transferred to New York, and then came to Chicago, and then came to New York, and then went back to Chicago. So this is a brother who has always been around us. He has not left his community, even though he had the chance to do so many, many times. Then he went on to talk about the promise of America. He says, this country of ours has more wealth than any nation, but that is not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military on earth, but that is not what makes us strong. Instead, it is that American spirit, that American promise that pushes us forward even when the path is uncertain, that binds us together in spite of our differences, that makes us fix our eyes on what is unseen. But what is unseen is that far better place around the thing. He's talking about vision. He ain't talking about a dream. He's talking about a vision. And as we all know, in order to do anything, you must first have a vision in your mind. And you must have the skills to manifest that vision. He said this promise is our greatest inheritance. And it is this promise that 45 years ago today brought Americans from every corner of the land to stand together on the mall in Washington, D.C. before Lincoln's Memorial to hear a young preacher from Georgia speak of his dream. We cannot walk alone, the preacher cried. And as we walk, we must take the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We shall never turn back. Now, Wright delivered this speech in a football stadium before a crowd of 80,000 people. That's history. Nobody in the history of presidential politics has ever done that. He moved the world with that speech. So we can't just look at him in the context of a black man speaking here in the United States. This is a black man speaking to the world which he has been a part of all of his life. And even mean-spirited Pat Buchanan had to acknowledge that Barack's speech was the greatest speech that at any political event by a presidential nominee. Even mean-spirited Pat Buchanan was moved by that message. Now, yeah, it's a lot of movement. Now, I got to be honest with you. As I watched the speech on television, I hung on his every word because I wanted Barack to do well, because I knew he was representing us before the eyes of the world. But as I heard Barack talk about America and the economy and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as I heard him talk about homosexuals, and I heard him talk about Israel, I found myself feeling like Jennifer Hudson in Dreamgirls. You know that scene in Dreamgirls when Curtis' manager is about to push her to the back and put Beyonce up front? And she said, but what about me? But what about me? I was waiting to hear him say something about us. I was waiting. But Barack, very skillfully and in code, made two references to a young preacher from Georgia who spoke of his dream 45 years ago that day. Now, the truth of the matter is, as we analyze his speech, we realize that he saved the best for last. He didn't have to mention King's name because everybody knew what day that was. Everybody knew the significance of Dr. King's accomplishment. So he didn't have to say his name. Just reference him. And symbolically, that reference would draw you to that particular moment in time. He's talking in code. Now, Eugene Robinson, a black reporter for the Washington Post, summed up this moment. And I want you to hear his analysis of that speech at that particular moment. He said that I haven't heard much about race during the Democratic National Convention, and that was clearly by design. And in terms of Obama's prospects, it was probably a good thing. A recent New York Times CBS poll found that 16% of white voters feared an Obama administration would favor blacks over whites. Obama has taken great pains to reassure voters that as president he would act without racial animus or resentment, and that he bears no grudges and intends to settle no scores. His success to date has depended largely on his ability to be seen as a candidate who happens to be black rather than a black candidate. Right? Now understand the truth of that. Understand where we live, in a racist country. If he came out and said what he really wanted to do, he would not have gotten as far as he had. Whites have always feared, after the end of slavery, after the end of colonization, after the end of apartheid, after the era of Jim Crow. White folk have always feared that we would do to them what they have done to us. But that's not in us. That's not our spirit. We have never aggressed against them like they have aggressed against us. But because of our miseducation, let's understand that. We aggress against ourselves. We aggress against ourselves because of that internalized racism, because of that internalized hatred. The key is, it took me a long time to really understand this and to resonate with what Dr. King's message was, that you can't harbor hate. If you really understand the process, the power and the emotions of love and hate. Hate destroys. The person who harbors hatred more than it destroys the object of your hatred. If you understand the power of the mind, the power of thought and consciousness, it's better to be neutral and indifferent than to hate, because that hatred destroys you. That is why we are destroying ourselves, sisters and brothers. That's why we kill each other, attack each other physically or verbally. That's why we kill ourselves with the poisons that we feel put in our bodies. Because of this hatred that we have not learned to neutralize. Because we have not learned to love ourselves. Because when people love themselves, they talk differently to each other. They treat each other differently. They don't accept unacceptable behavior in their community. So there are lessons that we have to learn. So if we are to heal ourselves, we need to begin to understand my final point. The final point that Wright talked about, it's not about me, it's about you. We have to begin to understand the role that we must play in this upcoming presidential election and beyond. Because it doesn't stop with this election. It doesn't stop with you registering to vote. It doesn't stop with you voting. That's just the beginning. We have to begin to galvanize ourselves, to mobilize ourselves, to do the things that we did 50 years ago, before we had the right to vote, before integration. We worked together as a people, but we lost all of that simply because we had the opportunity to live next to white folk, to work with white folk, to go to school with white folk, as if that was going to solve our problems. So we have to begin to realize that there's an aphorism, that all is fair in love and war. And if we've learned anything about the last 18 to 20 months of this presidential campaign, it's been that Americans love politics. And that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are hot political issues. History teaches us that every war is political. That wars are started by politicians, usually old white men. Every war has social ramifications that affects generations of people. So I would like to modify my aforementioned aphorism on the basis of my analysis and suggest that all is fair in love, war, and politics. Okay? So let's define these terms so that we can be clear about what they mean to us and their impact on our lives. Webster defines love as an intense feeling of affection and compassion for a person or an object. The National War College in Washington, D.C. defines war as organized chaos. War is defined as organized chaos. Politicians and war strategists are very clear that the first battle in any war takes place in the mind. And the first casualty of war is the truth. Politics exerts such a powerful force over our lives. It can generate intense feelings of love and hatred. And has domination over everyone on a local, state, and a national level. So, what is politics? And how can we use this power to improve our lives and to benefit mankind? Politics is defined as the theory and practice of forming and running organizations connected with the government. Another definition says that politics is the activity within a political party or organization that is concerned with debate and the creation and carrying out of distinctive policies. And the third working definition is politics is the use of tactics and strategies to gain power over a group or an organization. Politics and power go together like hand and glove, and both are oftentimes abused. Those in power have a tendency to look after their own, often at the expense of their opponents and the disenfranchised. And it brings to mind the old saying that when two elephants fight, or in this instance, when an elephant and a donkey fight, it is the grass that suffers. And those who suffer tend to look at politics and politicians in an unfavorable light. For example, one disgruntled voter said that a politician is one who serves God in such a manner as not to offend the devil. So Charles Hamilton Houston, a powerful brother, powerful attorney, Charles Hamilton Houston provided us with another definition, another option for examining politicians. He said that a politician is either a social engineer or a parasite. And so, I think to a large extent, those social engineers who can introduce and implement policies that change the course of people's lives in a favorable direction move beyond the definition of politics. They become statesmen, stateswomen. And the statesman is defined as a senior politician who is widely respected for integrity and impartial concern for the public good. Kwame Nkrumah was a statesman. Nelson Mandela was a statesman. Malcolm, Robeson, King would have made fine statesmen. Barack Obama has the mind and the heart to become a statesman. The statesmen are people who are of service to the people. They put service above profit. And they come from the people to serve the people. They're not imposed upon them by outsiders. So it is our responsibility to develop a sense of service within our communities first. It begins first within your household, first within your block, first within your community. Then it moves outside into the greater world. Carter G. Woodson, in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, talked about the need for service rather than leadership. This is in 1933, The Miseducation of the Negro, a book that is probably more relevant today than when it was originally written. I want to read to you some of Woodson's comments about service and its relationship to us. He says here that if the Negro could abandon the idea of leadership and instead stimulate a larger number of the race to take up definite tasks and sacrifice their time and energy doing these things efficiently, the race might accomplish something worthwhile. The race needs workers, not leaders. Such workers will solve the problems that race leaders talk about and raise money to enable them to talk about more. When you hear a man talking, always inquire about what he is doing or what he has done for humanity. Oratory and resolutions do not avail much. For if they did, the Negro would be in a paradise on earth. It may be well to repeat the old saying that old men talk about what they have done, young men talk about what they are doing, and fools of what they expect to do. The Negro race has a rather large share of the last mentioned class. If we can finally succeed in translating the idea of leadership into that of service, we may soon find that it is possible to lift the Negro to a higher level. Under leadership, we have come into the ghetto. By service within the ranks, we may work our way out of the ghetto. Under leadership, we have been constrained to do the bidding of others. Under service, we may work out a program in the light of our own circumstances. Under leadership, we have become poverty-stricken. By service, we may teach the masses how to earn an honest living. Under leadership, we've been made to despise our own possibilities and to develop into parasites. By service, we may prove sufficient unto the task of self-development and contribute to our modern culture. It may be difficult for some of us to let go of our old ways and move into a new tomorrow. But if you still feel the need for a leader, let it be a servant leader and not a self-serving leader. If you're ready for a change, know with no uncertainty that we are standing on the verge of a new tomorrow. And that new tomorrow begins today, at this moment. As Barack says, we must be the change that we are waiting for. The change won't come from the White House or anybody else's house. The change begins in your house. And once you understand who you are and what you need, then you will organize yourselves to let your voice be heard on a larger level so that you can affect meaningful and lasting change. The change begins for many people when you travel outside of this country, when you leave America and see the world. Traveling outside of this country is one of the best things that anybody can do because it helps you put your life in perspective. It helps you realize at one very basic and fundamental level that this is the wealthiest nation on earth. And the average poor person in this country lives better than the average person, than 90% of the people on this planet. And what are we doing with our money? What are we doing with the resources that we have at hand? We're making other folk wealthy. Right. We've heard the statistics. That's our doing. That's not someone else, that is us. And so I've learned from our own personal experiences the benefit of traveling out of the country. I made my first trip to Africa in 1980 when I went to Egypt with Dr. Benny. That trip changed my life forever because I had the opportunity to see with my own eyes information that I had never been exposed to in elementary school, high school, or college, even though I attended predominantly black schools all of my life. Teachers who looked like me didn't teach me the truth. Not because they didn't like me, but because they didn't know the truth themselves. They had never cultivated a deep appreciation for who they were as African people and travel outside of this country and see what we had done and bring those experiences back into the classroom. This past July, I made my 41st trip to Egypt. And it was a trip, this trip was basically my most profound trip. I saw things. I came back a changed person after this trip. I saw things that made me begin to see myself and my world differently. I'm working on a new book. I'm working on the second volume of Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. And so I plan to have it out next November. So I decided that I was going to go to Egypt early before my group. I normally take my groups in the summer. And I decided to go to Egypt early so I could do some research for this new book. And one of my colleagues in Egypt, an Egyptian guide that I've used for the last 20 years, have been encouraging me to come to Egypt early so that he could take me on a safari in the Western Desert. Safari that most African Americans, well actually no African American that he knows of has ever done this trip. So I decided, well, let me go out into the desert with this brother and spend like 4 days in the desert and see what's out there, and then I'll spend the rest of my time in Luxor doing some research, getting some photographs, preparing myself for this next book before my group comes over and I have to be involved with this, my group for 2 weeks. These 4 days that I spent in the desert were incredible because in the middle of the Sahara Desert, we went from the West Sahara Desert, west of the mountains, in the region between the Western Mountain and Libya. We moved from Cairo in the north to Luxor in the south and traversed the distance of about 600 miles in the desert. Now, this is real bona fide desert. But in the middle of the desert, I made some incredible finds. I found in the desert on one day shark's teeth in the sand. 8-million-year-old shark's teeth. Yeah. Which means that at one point in time, millions of years ago, all of this was an ocean. I found seashells in one area, seashells all over the sand. In another area of the desert, I found petrified trees, which meant that after the ocean receded, this was a lush tropical area. And the physical evidence I held in my hands in the form of a petrified piece of tree trunk. One evening, we're camping out in the desert, in the middle of the desert, sleeping on a blanket on the sand, pitch black darkness. Woke up about 2:30 in the morning, and for the first time in my life, I understood the expression, a blanket of stars in the sky. I could look up and every square inch of the blackness of night was dotted with the light, star, planet. I mean, it was gorgeous, it was beautiful. I never really seen the sky before. And as I'm, watching the sky, all of a sudden I began to make out constellations. I began to make out the star Sirius. And then to the left of Sirius, I saw this cluster of stars and gas known as the Milky Way, stretched from horizon to horizon, all the way across the sky. And then I saw shooting stars. And then, as I was up for like a couple of hours just taking all of this in and realizing that all we are is flesh and bones on this rock in space with billions and billions of other rocks, planets, stars, galaxies, solar systems. And it makes you realize how insignificant our lives are on one very basic and fundamental level. And on the other hand, it makes you realize how precious life is. How precious life is. Our ancestors in Kemet, thousands of years ago, saw those same stars. They saw the Milky Way. And in developing their culture, they created along the Nile River pyramids at Giza, which were a symbolic and astronomical representation of stars in the sky. There's research that's shown that the 3 stars at Giza are a representation of the 3 stars in the constellation of Orion, which the people of Kemet knew as Sahu, was associated with Asar. And in their text, in the very last lecture that Dr. Asa Hilliard did last year in Aswan, Egypt, 5 days before he died, his very last lecture, he talked about the stars in Kemet. And he related those stars to their sacred texts, their spiritual texts. And he talked about the fact that in their text, the so-called pyramid texts, they talked about the fact that when you die, your soul will ascend into heaven, into the Amduwa, into this place which is that same location, the first star in the belt of Orion, was the place where the souls of all folk went. And then he shared with us that NASA has acknowledged that it is that same star, it is that same segment of the universe, which is where stars are born. Galaxies are born. Our ancestors knew with crystal clarity things that we don't have the slightest idea. There's so much knowledge and information that is waiting for us to rediscover. So much information that is at our fingertips. But if you don't like to read, if you're too busy criticizing somebody, tearing somebody down, and engaging in activities to lift yourself up, you will never know a fraction of what there is to know. It's your life. It's your time. You have to use it to empower yourself. And then once you are empowered, then use that knowledge and that power to transform your world, your community. This is the time in which we live. The most significant part of that trip, though, was when I went to Luxor, and a colleague of mine told me about this Egyptologist who was digging in Luxor, a Russian Egyptologist who happens to live here in New York City. He introduced me to her, and what she showed me just took me on another level. This woman has discovered 3 tombs of Kushite noblemen from the 25th dynasties that are as important to the African community as the discovery of the King Tut's tomb has been to the European and contemporary Egyptian community. She's found this knowledge, and I've went into the tomb. I've seen the tomb. I've seen the significance of what is there. They are tombs of Karakabashkin, who is the vizier or mayor of the city of Waset, or Luxor today, under Shabaka and Piankin. There's another tomb of Karakamun, who was a priest of another king, who was royalty. And these tombs are significant because they are tombs built by Kushites of the 25th dynasty. They are tombs which depict these Africans clearly as Africans. The nose and lips haven't been chiseled out yet. So you can see who they were, carved by their own hands. And these tombs are identical to the tombs of their ancestors of the Old Kingdom, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties, the people who built the pyramids, wrote the pyramid text, and established the foundation that's going to be as significant to our community as George Jim James' Stolen Legacy was. It is a book in which he is going to substantiate beyond a shadow of a doubt the physical and spiritual reality of ancestral memory. All right? She's got the physical evidence from Johns Hopkins University to show that ancestral memory is real. They have identified the point in the body, the point in your brain where ancestral memory exists. And so now our job is to realize, as she talks about, as Dr. Newton talks about so eloquently, our job is to realize that our ancestors are waiting for us to come into our right minds so that they can work through us. These things that are happening now are not happening by coincidence. It's no accident that George Bush has flushed this nation down the toilet. It's no accident that this country is going to hell. It's no accident that Barack is poised to become the leader of this country, the most powerful nation on earth. And that is quite possible. It's quite possible because prior to April this month, I was one of the naysayers who said, well, you know, Barack becoming president of the United States is just like someone being promoted to the captain of the Titanic 5 minutes before it hits the iceberg.
Yeah.
Right? It looks like America is going down, but I know that spirit is real. Spirit is strong. And it flows best through melanated bodies. And the Barack has pure African blood in him and is connected to folk back in Kenya who are working on a spiritual level to protect this brother, to put him in a position where he can bring about meaningful change. But in order for that to happen, we got to do our job. We got to vote. We got to vote. We can't sit this out. Think about Medgar Evers. Think about Rosa Parks. Think about all the people who lost their lives, who lost their jobs, who went to jail, just so that we can have the basic right to pull that lever and cast our vote. See, and there is evidence of this biogenetic growth in the tomb in Egypt, the tomb of Ramesses IV. There's a scene on the wall that shows you this biogenetic growth, which means that in the 19th dynasty, our ancestors understood DNA. They understood ancestral memory and illustrate how that ancestral memory is passed down from generation to generation to generation to generations. Let us remember who we were. Let us be clear about who we are. And with reconstituted minds, let us build the world that our descendants will be proud to inherit. That's our job. That is what we have always done. And if we step up and do these things, then long after we are gone, our children will call our names when they pour libation. And they will say, well done. They will applaud us, they will respect us, they will revere us, because we have shown them what real men and women do when they are in their right minds and when they have courage. So I want to close with a phrase that's all too familiar in this political season. I'm Tony Browder, and I approve this message.
Thank you. I want everybody 10 minutes and we're going to be out of here. This is very important. 10 minutes and we're gone. I want to first just simply acknowledge a brother who spoke to us when we was at the Oberian Dempsey Center, and he was a little bit younger then, and I was certainly a little bit younger. But he's been doing some great things, and he's in the audience with us today, and that's Brother Ashangi, Ghetto Time. Let's give Brother Ashangi a round of applause. Also, a sister I hadn't seen in quite a while, Sister Linda Fletcher and company. Let's give them a warm round of applause over here. With us, Brother Browder dropped a few names, and I think that he didn't necessarily know where he was when he dropped those names. He asked us about, did we know Dr. Nichols? And fortunately, we have had him. In fact, I think we introduced Dr. Nichols to New York City. And outside of the academic circles, I believe we introduced Sister Pat Newton. to New York City as well. So there's a lot of history I want you to know. But it's been a real long struggle. It hasn't been easy, and there's been efforts afoot in this town to suppress it. And this is not only coming from white folks, but from Negroes as well, especially the Negro media, who are all in cahoots in trying to make sure that we do not learn anything. And one of the key culprits in all of this is Reverend Al Sharpton, because he seemed to hold sway over WLIB and KISS and others. So it is his job to try to keep us dumbed down and dealing with his sound bites. And then on top of that, he just joined up, as you probably know, because the Washington Post reported it, June 12th, 08, of him and Klein, as well as your school's chancellor down there in D.C., the female down there. They were all in a picture together, and they talked about how this relationship had developed of Sharpton being in league now with Klein to destroy the minds of our children. Now, why this is important is because next year, the legislature is going to have to consider again whether our children should be under the sole jurisdiction of the mayor or whether they will be returned to us. Now, those of you that know that Browder, that struggle was 40 years ago. And Bloomberg has killed that. And so now he seeks to get an extension of 4 more years to finish up the job. All right, so we got to be very clear about what is going on here, not only from others, but from those among us. Now, you know, it's sad because we save Negroes and then they turn on us. All right, we save Negroes and they turn on us. And you know, and I say this and I say it loud, there's nobody in the world that can talk about Sharpton but me. Because I'm still under a sentence. Several people fail to realize I'm still under a sentence because when I went to the grievance committee, they told me that if I didn't turn him in, that I was going to serve his sentence. Which shows you how long they had planned for him to be behind bars. So anybody that was Max got up there to talk about this, man, you got to be out of your mind. Because where were you? The only person I saw that stood up and said I would keep you out of the gallows was me. So how do you get greater authority than I did? All right, I don't understand that. So I say all of that because tonight, you know, we certainly salute Brother Browder being here with us, and you know, and there are so many others, and this is what's important. We, at this time, more than anything else, and I've said this so we can go past Obama now, because I've already predicted that Obama's going to be in the White House next year. And my predictions are usually pretty solid. All right, people who know me in this town know that when I say something, I say it well in advance, and they're pretty solid. America can ill afford not to have Obama. White America. They can ill afford not to have Obama. And more importantly, and I think you touched upon this, the world has already made a decision.
That's right.
All right, now, what does that all mean? That all means that the jury is already in.
Yes, it is.
It just got to be read in November. The jury got to be read. The verdict is already in. The people that run this world have already voted.
That's right.
All right? Let's understand that. The people that run this world already voted. And they have already voted Bush out. All right, they've already voted Bush out. And these people that we're talking about are the major bondholders all over the world. And they've already voted. They're the ones who own all of us. And they've already made a decision. This decision is too critical for us to have an impact on. See, the world is at such a crisis that they can't take a gamble on us, and they certainly can't take a gamble on McCain, who is insane. All right, he's insane. All right. His insanity is wrapped up in his medical records, which is sealed to us. All right, now George Herbert Walker Bush already knows those records, and he knows the depth of his insanity. All right, but to all of us, we're very much aware of that. But I think there's a couple things that you touched on which we should understand. There's no question about it, the demographics are very important. And demographically, we are going down. But the flip side of demographics is organization. That's the flip side. See, the mere fact that we are becoming the second largest minority, in quotation marks, in America, also has its benefits if we deal with organization. You see, and out of organization, the question becomes the skillful use of strategy and tactics. All right, that's what this is all about. See, we don't have to worry about numbers. All right, numbers are not that important. You have the power of one. Lieberman is controlling the Senate with only one vote. That's power of one. All right, he just talked about the power of one drop of black blood. See, you don't need the power of one. All right, you don't need the power of majority. It's the power of one. And as long as we know how to use that one, we will go ahead. That's the power of one. Tonight we're getting ready to leave. We had a wonderful evening. But I do want, there are a couple things we have to tend to before we do. We have the 50-50 raffle. And anybody who has not gotten a 50-50 ticket should hold your hands up, and we'll certainly take advantage of that. And the reason why the 50-50 raffle is done, because we got to understand, we run an office, and there's something called petty cash. And you can't run a business without petty cash. See, when you get ready, last week we sent out petitions to the Senate Banking Committee and to the House Financial Services Committee opposing the bailout plan. And in addition to opposing the bailout plan, we had our own remedy of asking for reparations and asking for a Marshall Plan for enslaved Africans. All right? So we've already put that before the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee from last week. We submitted a petition, got